So welcome to a public interview on Hegel and history, hosted by Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, 1920s to 1930s, new left, 1960s to 70s, and post-political left, 1980s to 1990s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. And you can learn much more about our activities or find a chapter local to you by visiting our website, platypus1917.org. Now, this past summer, 2021, Platypus hosted several reading groups, two of which allowed us to spend a great deal of time at the nexus of philosophy and Marxism. We held a reading group on Theodor Adorno's late work, Negative Dialectics, and a reading group on Hegel and Marx, primarily covering Hegel's shorter logic. These reading groups were to intercept and clarify the increased interest in questions of philosophy and radical politics of the past and present. And it is this renewed student interest that led us to pursue an interview with our esteemed guest today. Terry Pinkard is a university professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. Pinkard is the author of several books on German idealism generally, including many books on Hegel that have become standards in the field. Pinkard also has a forthcoming book, and I'd be excited to hear more about this in the Q&A or a future interview on the topic, but you have a forthcoming book on Sartre's appropriation of Hegel and Marx. That's correct, next January? Yeah. And Platypus, would like to take you up on that in the future. But for now, our focus is going to be on Hegel and history. And how this will work is basically Omair and yourself will have an exchange, and then we'll open it up to some audience question and answers. We can handle that on our end as far as the microphone goes. And we should conclude promptly within the next 2 hours. So by 7 o'clock on the Eastern time zone. Does that sound good? Sound good? All right.
Great to jump into it. Thank you, Professor Pinkard, for joining us, taking the time.
Thank you, Omair, for having me.
Sure thing. I wanted to begin with a biographical question that was actually kind of provoked when I was doing research for this interview by one of the YouTube videos uploaded in which you answer basic questions about Hegel. And you mentioned that when you first began your Hegel scholarship and your intellectual career, Hegel was, to say the least, out of fashion, right? And I think about my own experience. My attraction to Hegel as an undergrad between the years of 2008 and 2012, that was actually really initiated by people like you and Robert Pippin's work on Hegel. And I can make sense of that in a certain way as the expression of an exhaustion of postmodernism, a kind of feeling of postmodernism being a dead end. And this is how I understand, why our kind of emphasis in Platypus on the Hegelian dimension of Marxism is kind of appealing to people, that there is a sense in which the postmodern critique seems to have reached an impasse. But your interest in Hegel really began when it was maybe perhaps at its height, when Hegel was viewed not simply as not fashionable, but perhaps even the enemy. And so I would be curious to know, what initially attracted you to Hegel, especially in an environment that was hostile to Hegel?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and it goes back a long way. In a way, what happened is I backed into Hegel. That is, I became very interested in Kant, but that was by and large because I had some professors that were interested in Kant. And as a young undergraduate, I went to college between 1965 and 1969. That's for my bachelor. That gives you an idea of what point in history this was going on. I had some professors that were interested in Kant, and we were talking about, so I was interested in that. But of course, I also got very, very early on, right, taken up with New Left politics. And so I got very interested in Marx. Now, there weren't any courses being taught at the time on Marx, really. So I was, like a lot of people at that time, was more or less an autodidact on that. So coming from one end, I was really interested in Kant. Coming from the other end, I was really interested in Marx. And like a lot of young people at the time, I was also interested in the kind of ferment of, you might say, existentialism and so on that was going on. So In the course of all that, I got curious about Hegel and kind of backed into it. Coming from one direction, Kant forward, and coming from Marx backward, I decided I needed to know more about Hegel. And then I got just very interested in how different the Hegel was that I was reading when I was actually reading Hegel's texts from the Hegel that I had received as, this kind of weird guy who thought that there was, the world spirit was going to culminate in the Prussian state, and we were all supposed to be kind of, ants marching off into a large ant heap and so on. And I was just struck by all this, about how really very different it was. And as a consequence, I, you might say, just first out of just curiosity and surprise, I started reading more of this and kept coming back to it when I would go on to other things. And I began to see that there was really a much more of a connection between, you might say, that line that runs from Kant to Hegel to Marx, up to the various figures in the 20th century and so on about this.
Thank you. That's interesting because in Platypus, that's something we emphasize as well, which is the Hegelian dimension of Marxism. And I think it comes out in Ethan's description of Platypus as interested in emancipatory politics.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is something that we find resonance with in your work, which is you emphasize the extent to which history for Hegel is the story of freedom, or it's nothing, that this aspect of history being the story of freedom. And so I wanted to ask a couple questions on that. One, what does Hegel mean by freedom, right? There's a lot of sense in which freedom now, especially in the context of to the left, means libertarianism, a kind of freedom from the state. What is the content of Hegel's notion of freedom and history as the story of freedom? And also, if you could kind of talk about the historical context that allows for Hegel to make such a claim. What is it about Hegel's world that makes it reasonable to say that history might be the story of freedom?
Well, that's a fairly wide-ranging question there. But a couple of things. First of all, Hegel doesn't think history begins with freedom. He thinks that what's happened is we've developed an interest in freedom by virtue of the kinds of failures of the prior attempts to achieve something else. So, for example, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, if you just look at the chapter titles, right? The first chapters of self-consciousness are called self-sufficiency and unself-sufficiency, or independence and dependence, if you might like. Right? So that what happens is you get a kind of confrontation that ends up, of course, as we know, in the master-slave relation, where each side starts out claiming a certain independence for itself, what Orlando Patterson calls sovereignal freedom, but still kind of sovereignty. It's I will make the decisions and my will will be your will. It's out of the failures of mastery and servitude that we get a different conception, that we get a conception of freedom. Hegel thinks it has something to do with the way the ancient world moved, from a slave society into a society that was dedicated to freedom, but still had slavery as part of it. Went on to Stoicism and so on and so on. So first of all, freedom has emerged as the answer that we didn't know that we needed to a problem that we had. It was by virtue of the kind of breakdown, the dialectical breakdown of people struggling for pure independence. You might say the right to dominate others, that led to a conception of freedom. Now, what Hegel thinks, therefore, we mean by freedom is not, you might say, just given all at once, but is rather itself a developing concept here. It's as we think that what we wanted was independence. What we realized was that we are mutually dependent on each other, and that what we wanted actually was not independence per se, but something called freedom. When he talks about freedom, he always defines it in exactly the same way, and he thinks that the definition he gives is so clear, right? That we don't need really to worry about that. The definition is being bei sich in the German, being at one with oneself, or with oneself, quite literally, right? When the Germans mention that someone is bei sich, they often mean that he or she is alone, say they're at home alone or something. I take this to be what Hegel means is that you have the experience of freedom when you have the experience that your actions, your emotions, and so on are at one with you. That is, you are really acting in ways that are identical with what is constitutive for you to be an agent. But that is always socially bounded, because that abstract definition will not tell you what it is to be an agent. And one of the key ideas that Hegel has, which emerges out of the master-slave dialectic, is this idea of mutual dependencies, that we are always, not just in the kind of trivial ways, in which we all are socialized by, from birth and so on, but our agency is metaphysically social. We depend for the content of what we're doing and thinking and so on other agents here. The other thing that this sets up, Hegel thinks, it sets up, as he points out in the phenomenology, is that one of the fundamental components of this is what looks like an unovercomable opposition. It is the opposition between the pure individual, speaking from the first person standpoint, the I will do this. That pure individual who first is seeking into pure independence, and then the we, right? The plurality of all these I's that have a possibility of acting together in this case. Now you see this kind of joint plurality most clearly in something like the phenomenon of language, such that, one of the keys to reading the phenomenology, as it were, is the problem that's raised in the master-slave dialectic doesn't even come anywhere near to a resolution until the very last paragraph of the chapter on spirit, where Hegel starts talking about language as the existence of spirit. Spirit doesn't exist except insofar as it is people now communicating with each other, and linguistic communication is a paradigm of this. When I say we speak English, I'm not speaking as an individual, I'm speaking as the person that I am, you are, and we are manifesting this kind of social being, this particular language, whether it be English or German or Chinese or Urdu or whatever here, that the I and the we are already joined, but there's always a tendency to pull them apart. And so genuine freedom would be when these two are consonant, coherent with each other here. And this leads to then his view of what it would take for a kind of social life to be able to speak of itself as both individually and communally free. I think this is something that Marx takes up, by the way. I think this is one of the features that Marx takes over from Hegel, is he thinks this is just kind of clearly the right idea, and that Hegel had the wrong conception of what kind of social formation would actually enable freedom. So Marx thought it would only come about in a fully communist society.
Yeah, I guess, from my own reading of your work on Hegel, to recognize that for Hegel, this mediation of the individual and collective, and this is the contentious aspect of Hegel for later people, is the state. Potentially, that this is how the philosophy of right is read. And something in your work that you emphasize is what I would call the non-identity of civil society and the state, that potentially there could be a failure of the state to adequately mediate civil society. And, when we teach bourgeois philosophy and Platypus, and the concept of civil society is so kind of innovative to people, I would humbly suggest, perhaps because our society is so statified, but the idea of civil society seems to be something that strikes people as something they haven't come across before. So could you articulate, Hegel's conception of civil society and potentially address this question of, is the state the adequate expression of civil society for Hegel? And yeah.
Okay, this is again a very good and very deep and hard kind of question. It's hard to get a real, a short, quick handle on it. And one of the things that goes on, I think, in the philosophy of right, I think you have to back up even not just to civil society, but back up all the way to abstract right and morality. So you have these two opening sections of the book where Hegel talks about, first of all, abstract right, and he really does mean it abstractly. Now, he does identify abstract right as basically the Lockean triumvirate of life, liberty, and property. But as he's quite clear, right, that itself is just an abstraction. And he doesn't discuss, at least in the first part of the book, any of the particular institutional ways in which those kinds of things, right, have to appear. The second thing is morality. Morality has to do with kind of both the subjective internal motivations that we have, and more particularly the kind of, you might say, human rights oriented nature of morality. That is, morality is universalistic inherently. Hegel says at one point in his philosophy of history He says it's often said that Socrates was the discoverer of morality. Actually, he was the inventor, Erfinder. He was the inventor of morality. The idea that we could now have, ethical claims that went beyond the mere bounds of whatever community we were part of. It would include, at least in principle, everybody. Now, what's striking about those first two chapters is he doesn't discuss any institutional realization of those two. Now, this sets up, therefore, the idea that what you have is abstractions, which are true on their own, but they have no Dasein, they have no existence here, right, until they are institutionalized. And so when he gets to family, civil society, and state, he's now discussing what he takes to be the necessary ways in which those two things, morality and abstract right, are going to be institutionalized. And those are always going to be in the background. They're always there as potential tools of criticism and critique of whatever particular kind of family structure, civil society structure, state structure is going on here. So in civil society, what Hegel thinks is we now achieve something that's, of course, he thinks is brand new, right, with the modern world, which is this ability to have a separate sphere for oneself here, a sphere where you can really just kind of, as it were, pursue your own kinds of careers and so on. But it has to be done within a concept of a kind of citizenship. Now, remember, civil society in German is bourgeois society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft. Here. Such that you perform yourself as a kind of bourgeois, that is, you respect the rights of other people, you are in a position where you can try and make your own particular way in the world and so on, but you're held in also by, again, this kind of sociality, this, you might say, the moral drive to a kind of decency and so on. So civil society is a civil society, it's a decent society. It provides for its members and so on. It creates its own form of a state, what he calls the Notstaat, the state based on distress or the state based on need, to provide clean drinking water, public health facilities, so on and so on here. This is only decent. But even that still isn't going to hold things together. You need something that allows people to speak with a common voice. And civil society is always in danger of breaking up into lots of separate voices. Let me again return just to that analogy of language that Hegel uses when he says language is the existence of spirit. Spirit isn't real until it has some way of real, putting itself into actuality. And language is the existence of spirit in the sense you don't have spirit until you get people, as it were, talking to each other. For them to talk to each other now is to be expressing themselves as individuals in light of a particular shared medium here. The shared medium is the we, as in we English speakers. So it's not, for example, a kind of fractious we. It's not the we competitors in a particular market situation, or for that matter, we people in the research project of trying to read Hegel or something like that. It is a deeper, more constitutive sense of who we are as, say, English, we as English speakers. And Hegel thought that required a certain type of institutionalization. Now, what's controversial is that he thought that this kind of decent civil society couldn't work on its own. It required something like a constitutional representative government, not a democracy, because Hegel wasn't a Democrat. Constitutional representative democracy would also have a monarch and so on in it, etc. So the state was to be the institution which was to provide for this common voice, this sense of we, right? So when people say, we Americans have really fallen far short of, say, what we're supposed to be about, or we Germans have a particular kind of obligation to history that other nations perhaps don't have, and so on and so on. There you have, you have the idea that you are speaking with a particular voice, even with, a universal voice, even if there are people in that particular setup who are not agreeing with that. Nonetheless, there is this kind of universal voice supposed to be. Now, what's controversial is that Hegel thought that it was the state that did that. There was an institution called the state, a particular kind of governmental apparatus, that in this case is also something pretty much the nation state that was emerging in Europe, that this was the correct institution to embody that. And that's one of the things that I think Marx goes after in his critique of Hegel and the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, is not so much the line of reasoning that's going on there, but the idea that the state is the correct institutional embodiment. And that leads Marx back to ask why a market-based civil society would be the correct institution, and why the bourgeois family would be the correct institution here. That whatever the abstract rights to life, liberty, and property are supposed to be, and the claims about morality, they're going to require a different kind of institutional setup. That Hegel just got that part wrong here, and he didn't get it wrong on the matter of just a few empirical details. He got it kind of philosophically wrong, I think Marx thought. You want to follow up on that, Omair?
Well, I mean, I think you've raised $1 million question, right? And I know you've done a long YouTube talk on this, and maybe you could address it further, is how do you conceive of the relationship between Marx and Hegel? Where is their continuity? Where is their critique? How is Hegel relevant to understanding Marxism?
Well, I think one of the things that you find in the continuity between Hegel and Marx is one of the things that, of course, hasn't been understood is that Hegel comes out of Kant, but Hegel is very firmly a kind of reform school Aristotelian. That is, he wants to bring Kant and Aristotle together. A lot of people are trying to do that nowadays because people are coming to see the kind of shortcomings of a certain type of Kantian morality and Kantian liberalism and so on. But Hegel, what really did, when you read his lectures on Aristotle in the history of philosophy, it's quite clear that he thinks Aristotle got a lot of things right. For one, Aristotle had a good naturalistic understanding of what it was to be an agent. Marx is going to shift that over and call it materialism, but that's not really, I think, much of a difference there. What Aristotle, of course, didn't have was a conception of self-consciousness. Therefore, he didn't really have a good conception of how it is that Geist could be changing its shape over historical periods. Aristotle tended to think there was a human nature and it was going to be the same throughout all historical periods. It could find its embodiment in monarchy or democracy or aristocracy or whatever it might be, right? But it would always be the same kind of thing. Hegel thought Geist, as he says, is its own product. It shapes itself. It therefore becomes a moving target about itself. So if you start thinking of what it'd be like to be a self-conscious Aristotelian, therefore not to hold Aristotle's optimistic views about this kind of common human nature cutting across all these areas and levels of history. If you think about that, right, this is one of the things that binds Hegel and Marx together. And it was the young Marx who saw that much more clearly than anybody else about Hegel. I think it's the Marx that is leading up to the German ideology and so on here, or German ideology in the manifesto here. So it's a kind of called this kind of what I call the disenchanted Aristotelian naturalism that binds Hegel and Marx together. One of the things that is also, I think, going on about that, this is a little more arcane. It's often said of both Hegel and Marx, they are in many ways philosophers of the life world, the real nitty gritty life world that we, take up every day and so on, and so on, and so on. Of course, the life world is this concept that has its philosophical basis really in Husserlian phenomenology and to some extent in early Heideggerian fundamental ontology and so on. Neither Hegel nor Marx, I think, is a philosopher of the life world. They are instead philosophers of what you might call forms of life. Form of life, Lebensform, right, of course, is a famous Wittgensteinian kind of term. And it's often thought that a form of life, even in Wittgenstein or whatever it might be, is also equivalent to the life world, the Husserlian life world. I don't think this is true. I think that what they're talking about here, this is something I've talked about in a little article called Forms of Thought and Forms of Life recently, is that a form of life is differentiated according to its logical structure. If the science of logic is, Hegel says, as it were, Linehan, right? As it were, the thoughts of God before creation here. It is the form of reality. here. That's what the logic would give us. But the form of reality is still abstract. It won't give us reality itself. Nonetheless, what we wanted, therefore, is we wanted to see how life now emerges and what kinds of logics there are to various forms of life. Now, Marx is going to give this a specific kind of twist. He and Engels together were going to claim that the form of life, the logic of a form of life, is going to be structured around the modes of production of a given society. This has been interpreted as if Marx is claiming some kind of, materialistic causal thesis about the way consciousness functions. And sometimes Marx and Engels talk like they might be meaning, but I don't think this is actually going on. And when you connect the early writings to the later stuff and so on, and also when you look at the later writings like the theories of surplus value and so on, when Marx talks about these ideas about forms of life and so on. He and Hegel, I think, both are suspicious of the idea of forms of life because a form of life can simply embody the particular kind of ideology and so on of a particular period here. And so that what both of them are concerned with is trying to work out what the logic of a form of life is. And one of the things that also unites them is when they're working out this logic, both of them think that, again, following Hegel, that you do this in the middle of things. Right? We're always caught up in this kind of historicity. We're always in the middle of a historical change. Hegel says philosophy is its own time grasping thoughts, but by that he means not a snapshot of where we happen to be right now, but its own time, that is, where it came from, its history, where it is right now, and what kinds of illusions it might be entertaining about itself, and what kinds of issues are on the horizon for it to solve. Here, that's one of the things that we can do. We can't actually say exactly how we're going to solve it, or we're going to say which among all these possible solutions and so on might be picked. But at least what we want to try and do is understand what's on the horizon as the problems that our time needs to take up. And for Hegel, that was in the wake of the revolution, in the wake of the Congress of Vienna, right? How do we institutionalize freedom as best we can? And what he thought in the philosophy of right is what he be the best way to do it. Marx, of course, thought that given the rapid rise of industrial capitalism here, that now there were a whole set of different problems that were on the horizon, and that to grasp our own time and thought, therefore, was to grasp what the possible kinds of ramifications of all that might be. But not to do this kind of, life world analysis of kind of the culture and where we are and so on and so on.
No, that's great. Thank you. To bring in history, I kind of wanted to return to the question of postmodernism and how we might understand the rejection, I guess, not only of Hegel's narrative of intelligibility, but at its most extreme, that the claim to attempt to be intelligible, to grasp the world through reason, is itself the enemy, the problem, et cetera, what needs to be defeated. Does Hegel account for his kind of later rejection, this kind of rejection of the claim to know as such, the rejection of German idealism as bound up with, I guess, an authoritarian capitalism? Or do we need something beyond Hegel to understand his rejection in the 20th century?
Well, that's a great question too. I think there are really two ways to go about that. Even sketching out an answer. Let's call it one of the kind of the obvious one, and the other one is the really much more esoteric way of thinking about it that appears in the relation between Hegel and Heidegger, for example. Go back to the first one, right? Hegel thought that there was a kind of danger in his own day. He discussed it in the Phenomenology already and so on, of the contemporary society kind of devolving into a set of highly individualistic, ideas, right? Where everybody's concerned really with their own inner life, their own purity, and so on and so on. And it's kind of craziest form, it collapses into a community of beautiful souls, none of whom think they can really communicate with each other, but nonetheless go about establishing fellowships to communicate and congratulating each other on their superior virtue, and so on and so on and so on here. I agree that with one of the kind of quips that Terry Eagleton made about postmodernism, which is it all just sounds like a large shopping mall. It all sounds like just consumerism. You know, it's just a bunch of individuals making their choices about what they need to do and so on. And then there was, postmodernism also kind of came about around the time of the Gulag Archipelago and so on in France. Postmodernism, I mean, the term itself was coined in France. And there was a whole group of intellectuals that were also very attracted by this kind of Popperian idea that there's the open society and its enemies, and Marxism, Hegelianism, all these things are totalitarian. Anybody who wants to get a grasp of the whole is a totalitarian. All there are individual choices and so on and so on and so on here. So first of all, postmodernism for a Hegelian is going to be a kind of ideological distortion of the logic of a particular form of life. It's one way of looking to take things into the future that Hegel thinks is probably fairly well doomed to make sense of itself here. Postmodernism, you might say, runs into just kind of the standard objections against lots of it's quite simple-minded relativism. If everything's relative, then that's relative too, and so on. But that's part of it. So part of it is just the postmodernism, at least in one respect, if say people like Hegel are right, it really is a form of it's a consumer logic, as it were. We're just all making individual choices. Is itself a kind of expression of a certain type of neoliberal understanding, right? Where instead of just seeing these individual consumer choices as being restricted to the economy, we extend the philosophical picture right across all the way into every aspect of human life, that everything is seen as simply a capitalist individual transaction. You might say the kind of theoretical grandeur and comic culmination of it is Gary Becker's analysis of the family as basically a whole set of individual transactions and so on, for which he won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, the more esoteric way of looking at that is to go to, say, Heidegger, who accuses basically Hegel, in fact, almost all the Western philosophical tradition, of ignoring human finitude, of somehow wanting to think that it can somehow escape the bonds of history and temporality and so on, and get a standpoint that is somehow in the flux, but not of the flux here. And that Heidegger spent 30 or 40 years arguing with Hegel about this in print and in his lectures and so on, to the extent that he thought Hegel is simply assuming from the outset a kind of way of escaping from finitude that Heidegger thought was itself just another choice, right, made from within a particular kind of historical flux and so on. And that, what would Hegel say to that? Well, that now it starts getting very esoteric. Well, look, Heidegger, let's go back to the logic. You're exactly right. We can't just assume this, otherwise it would be pure dogmatism. Let's see now, let's just start out with, ground zero and see where we go from there. And let's see how we would develop now a particular way in which we could understand ourselves as being in the flux, but as being the way the flux now understands itself as flux, and that itself now being a certain type of absolute knowing. We have a couple of hours this afternoon, but we won't resolve that, at least in that amount of time.
Yeah, it might point beyond philosophy itself, the issue. Because, you raised the historical dimension of Hegel, and one ponders if there's a historical dimension to someone like Heidegger coming around in the early 20th century and saying, look, we need to account for our finitude. That can we understand Heidegger's response in a historical context as well? But I wanted to kind of abruptly shift, and you could speak to that in this next question as well. But you characterize yourself as a left Hegelian, and one thing I find interesting is, would Hegel himself have to make that distinction between left and right Hegelianism? How do we understand the emergence of the phenomenon of a split in Hegel between left and right? If you could maybe speak to that.
Well, this goes back to a lot of things, but I mean, the split between the left and the right Hegelians was basically a religious split. It appears on Hegel's funeral, right? I mean, there are two people who speak at Hegel's funeral, right? Friedrich Pfister and the theologian Mohanica. Heinecke talks of Hegel as a very good Orthodox Christian, who has joined his Savior at God's side today, and et cetera and so on. Verster talks about him as a great secular thinker, the person who really saved us from all kinds of other, all kinds of bad thoughts and false understandings of where we are and what we need to be doing and so on. So to Hegel's students, many of them, Hegel's students and friends, right? Many of them really took Hegel to be an Orthodox Christian. Many of them took him to be, well, like say David Friedrich Strauss, for example, right? The person who coined the terms left and right Hegelian, took him to be someone who was in fact, right, not really that religious. One of Hegel's friends and students, Heinrich Heine, right, of course, famously commented that, Hegel was basically, a non-religious thinker, right? And was kind of was the person who laid the eggs for all the, cackling little atheists and so on that were around in Germany at that time. Hegel himself never, of course, really resolved that. I mean, now, one of the questions is, did he resolve it because he didn't want to resolve it, or, and so on? He wanted to kind of finesse it and so on. And there's some historical reason to think that might have been influencing Hegel. If Hegel had been declared to be a non-religious thinker, he probably would have lost his position. He would have been banned from teaching in any German university. At one point, he was even thinking on moving to Belgium, right? At least not thinking, but entertaining the thought. Moving to Belgium, where they had offered him a position and so on. So there's some reason to think that Hegel wanted to kind of downplay his own particular views on this. Now, my own views are, as a left Hegelian, is that Hegel did have a particular conception of Christianity. It was Johannine. He says this over and over again in his lectures, that the Gospel according to John is in fact the correct view. The view is, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, that sounds like pantheism. Hegel knows and says, if you get charged with pantheism, right, then you are unemployable, basically, here. I think that was Hegel's Christianity. I think it's a very radical form of Christianity. People like Strauss later on said it's really only one tiny step away, right, from being non-Christian at all, and so on. And that's where the left and right Hegelianism began. Now, then what happened, of course, was that the left Hegelians who split with the right Hegelians on matters of religion also began to split with all those other people about social and political philosophy here. And so left Hegelianism then itself became part of this kind of, progressive strain that goes on and so on. I mean, it runs through, Edward Gans, right, all the way up to the founding of the Social Democratic Party by a bunch of young Hegelians and so on, as not merely a left religious position, but also now a left political position, which grew out of that. And that's that tradition of left Hegelianism that began with Edward Gans, one of Hegel's closest friends. He writes when his wife takes the kids away to visit the family back in Nuremberg and so on. He writes that he spends all of his time with his one true friend, Edward Gans. And Gans himself was a Republican. He was arguing for the Republican point of view in his lectures on Hegel's philosophy of right. He wasn't particularly religious, right? He was Jewish and a kind of cynical convert to Protestant Christianity in order to get his position as professor and so on. So I think Hegel was aware of all this, and to be honest, I think he probably thought he had finessed it well enough in his philosophy of religion by declaring that really what we mean by God is the Logos. Hegel's God is more like Aristotle's God, but now reinterpreted. Aristotle's God that just thinks about itself all the time here, but now reinterpreted in a way to try and make it at least compatible with some forms of official state Christianity.
Great, thank you. Another kind of awkward shift. I wanted to introduce the Frankfurt School, and once again, in doing research, I noticed you wrote a paper on Adorno's negative dialectics that I didn't make all the way through. But it seems like Adorno presents a kind of strange point to consider Hegel through, because on one hand, he could be accused of a kind of postmodern suspicion about the Enlightenment project. On the other hand, he could be viewed as a kind of dogmatic Hegelian. And so to what extent, or how do you understand the relationship between the Frankfurt School and Hegel? Is that different than Marx's? Does it draw out something new? Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. So,
I mean, first of all, remember now the Frankfurt School is now a large school, right? I mean, it's a large school and it's no longer in Frankfurt necessarily. A large part of it's still in Frankfurt, but you have Rahel Yegi in Berlin, you have all the other critical thinkers that are scattered around the world and so on. And I say Frankfurt critical theory, actually, I think probably if you actually just counted up the number of adherents, it's probably the largest school of philosophy in the world right now here. But what is the relation then? Well, the Frankfurt School started out, it wanted to use Marx, but not to be necessarily Marxist. They wanted to, kind of do what Marx did with Hegel, which is now go one step further and see what we need to do in this very changed world, in the world that Marx had operated in. So they also but they were also, very conversant and so on with Hegel. You see this especially with, say, the early Horkheimer and so on. So one of the things that went on was to try and see, especially in the 60s and 70s in Germany, was to see if there was any way of kind of, re-engaging with the dialectic as a way of engaging in critical theory. This is very much part of what Adorno was taken up with and so on. And to use now, go back to look at Hegel to see if Hegel has some particular kinds of insights that will allow us to, out-Marxify Marx himself here, and allow us to do certain kinds of things with a type of culture critique and a way of understanding the wrongness of contemporary life and so on, without actually trying to make Marx back into Hegel. And someone like Habermas, of course, right, wants to basically replace the dialectic with a theory of communicative freedom here. This is something Michael Teunissen, in his book, Being and Semblance, Sein und Schein, had concluded, in fact, that the last chapter was on how the logic of the concept was really the logic of communicative freedom here. And this would allow us yet to go one step further than this. Rahel Yegi has brought back this idea of Hegel as a philosopher of forms of life, and that therefore this is a way of taking up, the relation between Hegel and Marx in a different way that's not yet the Adornian way and so on, right? Without now trying to look at the way the 60s and 70s Germans were trying to do by saying what we really need to do is get the idea of a dialectic as a kind of specific type of logic that will allow us to pin this on in various ways and so on. Maybe we need something like a negative dialectic instead of just a positive dialectic here. There are other ways, I think, of wondering whether Adorno just grappling with Adorno's understanding of all this and so on. There are many ways in which Adorno is also taken up with the Heideggerian suspicion that Hegel is simply not dealing with finitude, and that a truly finitude-based philosophy would perhaps still be dialectical, but wouldn't be dialectical in the way that either Hegel or, for that matter, Marx per se, right, would have taken it. That's it's a big question. That's a kind of big overview type of answer and so on, but we could go into that in more detail. Do you want to follow up on that, Omair?
Sure. I actually just want to ask one last question so we can have time for question and answer from the audience. And it's a big question and it might be beyond your pay grade. But it's the question Marx poses in the 1844 manuscripts, which is, how do we now stand as regards the Hegelian dialectic? I think one thing that is really great about someone like your work or Robert Pippin's work is that it tries to show the applicability, the rationality, the swallowability of Hegel. And yet, one thing I was trying to raise in some of my questions about the rejection of Hegel is in what ways might Hegel be inapplicable and yet still critical and radical, precisely because he's inapplicable? Have we fallen below Hegel? Has history regressed from Hegel? And so I guess the general question, in what ways does Hegel still seem readily apparently applicable? In what ways does he seem outmoded or potentially superseded or undermined?
Well, yeah, one of the ways, I think, this is going to sound more like just a slogan than anything else, right? One of the ways in which Hegel is still applicable is that Hegel is still a conversation partner who's actively engaged with us, unlike some other things that have just kind of vanished, right? And so on. You think of when you're doing things in the history of philosophy as I do. You're often reading people that nobody reads anymore, just because you're curious about what the context in which all these people were writing. There are other things that have vanished, right? Hegel is still very much, in the thick of things. That is, we're still trying to understand, the kind of the tensions and contradictions and so on that go on in various types of philosophical, first of all, just abstract philosophical ways, like understanding agency in general. And Hegel has lots of good things to say about that. But also the very idea that there's something going on that has to do with the kinds of what look like unovercomable oppositions that in fact make sense or are comprehensible when they're put into a larger type of, or I say, organic framework, or a larger type of comprehensible, whole that's comprehensible. What Hegel would call the idea, right? The unity of these kinds of opposites, the unity of concept and objectivity. One of the other ways in which Hegel, I think, is very much applicable to us is that unlike a large stream of philosophy, which is not engaged with its own historical time, or actually, as you might put it, actually is engaged with its historical time without realizing it's engaged with its historical time, is that Hegel is, again, very conscious that we are always in the middle of things here. We are always our own time grasped in thoughts here. And that we therefore have to reflect on what it is about our time that leads us to pose things in a certain type of way. So going back, for example, to what we were just talking about in postmodernism, to understand postmodernism as its own time grasping thoughts is to understand what it is about our time, which is a time when neoliberalism, especially in the 90s and so on, was really in the ascendancy. So understand what it is about our time that would make that seem like it was an appropriate, even kind of exciting way to approach things here. And maybe even looking as if it were emancipatory when in fact it was actually leading us back into a further type of bondage, you might say, into the neoliberal bondage here. So Hegel is very much applicable. This doesn't mean Hegel is got the answer to everything, right? As Hegel puts it in the preface to the Logic and the preface to the Phenomenology and so on, kind of this is the best I can do. It's surely not good enough, right? But we all do our little part, and and so on. The individual, as he puts it in Phenomenology, really plays a very small part. We're just kind of trying to communally help each other along in this way. And Hegel, by being the kind of self-conscious historicist that he is I think more applicable than many, many, many other thinkers outside of Marx and so on are for these kinds of things. Another thing is that there's one of the forms of, you might say, vulgar Marxism is the attempt to really claim that history really has nothing to do with what anybody thinks. It has to do with certain types of material forces. And that can be given a very kind of conservative twist, as as Brodel gave it, right? That, the last analysis, right? It's climate and geography and just distance and the facts of human life about birth and death and diseases and so on. The ideas that people have are interesting, but they're not the drivers of things. Hegel thinks that there's a give and take between material conditions and our ideas, but it's not that one determines the other in this case, right? As if Hegel thought it was only our ideas that were driving things, because these ideas always occur in a very concrete social material context here. But it's not as if the social and material context is completely determinative of the ideas that we have. And this respect, right, in this respect, his views are also consistent with his views about history being the consciousness of the progress of freedom.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Ethan, if you want to open it up to audience Q&A.
Okay, how's the feedback? Is there still feedback on the microphone?
No, you're actually a little muted. You could probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pinkard, for that. While we're formulating our queue and getting some questions here in the audience, I wanted to ask you the first question, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'm struck by what to me sounded like a little bit of a tension, and I hope you could unpack it in some of your remarks. On the one hand, you spoke of these life worlds, these forms of life, and you mentioned that for Hegel, that looked like one thing. There was one social formation that would guarantee freedom, and for Marx, there might be another. And he spoke of it as being a philosophical critique. Marx thought that Hegel had formulated something wrong philosophically. On the other hand, you mentioned, and I think quite rightly, with Marx, there are new problems posed in the industrial era. There are new tasks to be taken up that perhaps Hegel didn't live to see, and that might pinpoint maybe not a problem in thought, but something new in reality, something new materially that Hegel maybe couldn't address. And I wondered if you could speak to that. What register really was Marx's? What was he addressing Hegel? Was it as a philosophical thinker or as a problem in reality?
Well, look, again, whole series of just very good questions and difficult to answer, right? Especially in a very short period of time. One of the things that's going on, I think, with one of the obvious things that's going on with Marx and the critique of Hegel here is that Hegel's conception of civil society is still very much a kind of that of an early artisanal conception of capitalism. Hegel never got a chance to visit Britain, right, which was now rapidly industrializing itself. But the Prussia he was living in was now self-consciously trying to copy the British example. He was putting in gas lighting. By the time of Hegel's death, there were 60 steam engines in Berlin, right? All English, everyone made in England. But Hegel had a more limited artisanal conception. He had a conception of there being factories, right, with artisanal workers, each now breaking themselves up into producing various parts. If you think of something like the artisanal factories, say, of being not the pin maker, right, that Adam Smith talked about, but the say a watch manufacturer, where one person be doing something like making the mainsprings, another person be doing something like fashioning the gears. It would then finally go down the line to where someone would now start assembling all these together. All this could be done so that you could produce now products at a greater number and at a lower price. So what he didn't see was just the massive use now of, well, fossilized fuels and the way in which those small artisanal capitalist firms were going to become these giant, smoke belching firms and so on here. They're going to lead to something like an industrial proletariat. Hegel had already gotten the idea that there was a problem with kind of day workers, the Tageslöhner, as he calls them in the philosophy of right and in his lectures there. There's a problem with the day workers, but that was still something that the kind of mechanisms of civil society, the Notstaat, the state based on need, could overcome with distributive means and so on and so on and so on here. Hegel himself was very skeptical about, well, more than skeptical. Hegel himself simply did not believe that the market itself would naturally right itself, and therefore there was always going to be a kind of need for intervention. Marx came to believe that with the rise of industrial capitalism and the kind of vast wealth that it was demonstrating, and the kind of ruthlessly competitive nature that it did, that, to quote one of the most famous lines, that all that's solid melts into air, and man is finally, all the past is profane, and man is finally forced to confront his real existence here, which is not that of the kind of small artisanal production that Hegel is going on. So I might say in the background, what Hegel has assumed is that there is a kind of way of which, the good part about capitalism, the vast amount of wealth it's creating and so on, the way it's now changing life forever, probably for the better and so on, can all be tamed sufficiently by the small scale interventions of the institutions that make up the state based on need. And that, of course, now here's where Hegel really goes wrong, and Marx points it out, right? Is thinking that also this can all be amply regulated, right, by the state, which populated by, what amounts to basically educated technocrats from the best universities who study with the best professors and so on. They will all have, the good of the whole in their mind and so on. They'll be the universal class. They will do only what is best for the whole. And that Marx pointed, this also can't work in this kind of new environment here. The old bourgeoisie, which was already fairly wealthy, is now staggeringly wealthy. And they control almost everything in a way that Hegel himself simply couldn't have foreseen. Now, one way of reading Marx's critique is to say, let's take Hegel's logic, but now follow it out in light of the way in which this logic has worked out in actuality, right? Such that the kinds of institutions that Hegel thought were best to embody this kind of freedom are themselves not going to function that way anymore. So that what you have is, now, if you want to put it in Hegelian terms, what you have is that since the idea is the unity of concept and reality, that's Hegel's definition of the idea. The concept and reality have somehow come apart. That reality is no longer measuring up to its own concept of itself as this universal, egalitarian, freedom-based idea here, and therefore requires something different. The great split then between the Marxists and the Social Democrats and so on came to be with whether or not we needed a full-scale transformation of capitalism into something different, or we could effectively, right, democratize society enough so that we could tame capitalism with some regulatory mechanisms and so on. That was the great social democratic versus Marxist split over this, which continues to this day here. So in that way, it's not as if Marx is saying, look, Hegel, you just got the facts wrong. Hegel actually, you might say, didn't get his facts wrong so much as the facts began to change after Hegel's death, rather rapidly after Hegel's death, such that by 1844, Hegel died in 1831, by 1844, the world is suddenly looking very, very different than it did before. Now, I think there's an analogy in our Monday, which is the introduction of the internet, which has changed everything in a very, very short period of time. It's kind of hard to believe that the iPhone was only introduced in 2007, and now it seems like most of the world, right, has an iPhone, and everything is now different in many ways. So I see this as my own way of taking this is to say Marx has got the logic and is taking it forward. He has rejected, of course, the right Hegelian view of this as this kind of large spiritual process, and so on and so on. He's really seen what you might call the Aristotelian heartbeat of the Hegelian system, and how once you've introduced self-consciousness into this, right, the system is now very different from a pure Aristotelian system, and that's what he's after in his later works on capital and the theories of surplus value and things like that.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take our first question from our audience, and please do let us know if you can't hear it. We'll work on these microphone volume levels.
Okay. Okay, I can't. I didn't hear that. I heard that somebody said something, but.
You didn't hear what I said. Is it better?
Let me try one thing to adjust it.
Try it one more time.
Okay, how about now?
Hey, good.
Okay, great. I was interested in asking about the difference between Hegel and Marx's conception of the state that you've been discussing, and the relationship of philosophy to the state. Marxism in Orthodox Marxism of the late 19th and early 20th century had the idea that the capitalist state needed to be smashed and replaced by a dictatorship of the proletariat, which would then wither away slowly in the free society. So this idea that eventually you would overcome the state. What is Hegel's conception of the state, and how is it different? And why is it that in the 20th century, people, what's the appeal of Hegel, right? After the failure of kind of the Marxist attempt at revolution and their way of thinking about the state and society and the problems of our time, and the rise of the administered state of the 20th century. Why is there a resurgence of interest in Hegel? And is there something that you or others believed that one ought to learn from Hegel's view of philosophy and the state that was different from kind of the debates within the left around Marxism and liberalism about the state?
Oh gosh. I mean, there's several threads I think that would go on about that. First, Marxists did think that the state would wither away here, and that what we really needed to do was smash the bourgeois state, replace it with something else. Now, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is also a term that Marx uses, right, and so on. And that what this is going to be analogous to the way in which the ancien regime state, right, was smashed, was replaced by a bourgeois state. Okay, now we have got to smash that and replace it with a socialist worker state. The basis, the kind of the constitutional legal basis of the state is going to be different in all three cases here. I think in many ways that's the way Lenin originally thought of it, although in the heat of events, I think things kind of, he was forced to make a lot of choices and so on. He didn't necessarily at first want to have to make, but in any event, right, one of the things that's going on is that there is a kind of still a Hegelian understanding of what a transformation in history is the fundamental model that Hegel has of kind of revolutionary transformations in history is that a form of life simply breaks down. I can break down all at once, as happened, say, in the French Revolution, or it can break down really over a long and agonizing set of centuries, as happened in the transition from the ancient to the modern world. In these conditions of breakdown, right, what happens is that people find themselves living in the rubble, as it were, of the breakdown. What they do is they pick up the parts that still work and they then toss the other parts aside, right, and so on, and they build something new out of that. This is a more complicated historical story, right? I think this is what Lenin was trying to do in the new economic policy of the 1920s. But Lenin had a stroke and died, and so he wasn't able to continue it, and Stalin interrupted that here. But Lenin had a conception that, we are now living in the rubble of, right, the authoritarian quasi-capitalist state of this modern Europe, and that we have to pick up the parts that work, right? We have to be experimental about that. That's what he was doing, pick up the parts that work and go on from there. I think that this is, by the way, one of the things that's going on in the contemporary relation between the party and society in China. That is, the party sees itself as picking up what works, but nonetheless maintaining a certain, at least ideally maintaining a certain type of socialist control, certain type of legal control. Now, there's lots of problems with the way the Chinese are trying to do this, but at least that's part of the implication of this. So in that respect, right, there's nothing that would surprise Hegel about this. This is the way these kinds of revolutions have always taken place, by these forms of breakdown and then rebuilding, so that the past is always going to be preserved in a certain sense. You're going to, like I say, pick up the parts that work, preserve part of the past, but discard the parts that don't work in this case. So that one of the questions then has to do with, given the failure of what happened in the Soviet Union, and given the success of what's happened in China, at least success in one sense here, right? How are we now to try and conceptualize, right, and so on, to understand the ways in which there are things that are now on the agenda for us, and what kinds of possible solutions there are for these kinds of things. Now, the way if we keep thinking of it as just capitalism versus socialism, and Chinese is socialism. So if you're a Republican, that's terrible, and so you've got to start to rethink things about this kind of way. Now, something like the Hegelian dialectic is as good a place to start as any, because it's a dialectic about dynamic tension. It's a dialectic about what happens in breakdown. It's about always being in the middle of things, right? Not thinking that you've got now the long-term kind of solution in this. It's also about not drifting off into the nostalgia about the past. In Hegel's time, this was nostalgia for, say, Greek democracy, which he thought was misplaced because Greece broke down, and it broke down for essential reasons, not for accidental reasons. Nor is it going to be utopian, just kind of telling the world, look, this is what we ought to be, and we're just going to reform things from the ground up immediately right now, and so on. it was much more, Hegel was in that respect much more reality-based, and that way also, at least in that respect in the new economic program, Lenin was also much more reality-based here. So what does Hegel have to say about all this? Well, you need to understand, this is one of the reasons why we can't really answer this right now just per se, right? We need to understand what all the dynamics have been in the 20th century and now what is open to us in the 21st century. Questions about how much the internet has changed things, right? We're in the middle of this. We don't actually know it. Maybe that 30 years from now, we'll say, no, the internet actually didn't make that much of a difference here. It just, accelerated certain types of capitalist processes so that Apple can get, computers built in China and get them shipped over to America, and it can all work, without much of a hitch and so on, but capitalism goes on here. But at least that kind of way of understanding the kinds of internal tensions, and also the kind of you might say the desire to escape that Marx, puts it right, in the 18th Brumaire, where he talks about, the way the dead, the deeds of the dead prey upon the brains of the living and so on, such that we think, oh, we need to go back and find, some solution in the past, as if we could say, go back to Hegel or just to Marx per se and find exactly the right solution for what we need to be doing now. Or the attempt to just drift off into a kind of, saying, oh, well, in the future, though, everything will be free and, we'll all be famous for 15 minutes and everything will be fine here. I think outside of that kind of very general answer, I don't know that there's a whole lot to be said. But there, I think one of the things right now, for example, is to be looking at how the Chinese are handling their market economy and how the party and developing this kind of surveillance state is perhaps developing in a way that is antithetical to the way in which a full socialist economy should be developing. But on the other hand, they're doing a great job at generating wealth, and now they're looking forward to trying to distribute that wealth more in a more egalitarian fashion. Can they do that without doing some of the other things that they're doing? All these are real debates, right? As we're speaking, nobody has a definitive answer on those things.
No, tap it and then.
Hey, can you hear me now?
No, a little bit louder.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I just wanted to return to the earlier discussion about the left-right Hegelian split and Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. I guess something that I had in mind is you were discussing maybe that they differed on the question of the institutions for realizing human freedom. And another part of Marx's critique of Hegel is, at least it appears like Hegel is flipping the subject and predicate, that the predicate becomes subject and the subject becomes predicate. Or he'll say things like Hegel turns man into subjectified state as opposed to man objectifying themselves in the state, right? Reference to democracy. And Marx's critique of Hegel there is also really much more a critique of the contemporary young Hegelians' kind of views and accounts of what a proper state form would be. And so I guess I bring that up because a running theme in Marx's writings is that sometimes the most simple concept is the most concrete one, right? So he talks about labor, and that potentially those most simple concepts can themselves become estranged, right? This is what Marx called capital. And it seems like that kind of early critique is his way of saying, look, we can't just judge this any longer in terms of which institutions, at least at its time, at least that seems to be an unsatisfactory answer, but maybe even the accounts of the institutions themselves seems to have become upside down. And that's why it seems like, at times Marx is even giving like a Hussain critique. He's saying, don't forget about civil society, it fights against the state. So I was wondering how you see Marx's critique there, and also as an intervention into the kind of left-right Hegelian split and their argument that's happening. This is related to Omair's earlier question about the continuity and difference between Hegel and Marx.
Okay, if I understood your question, right? The question I think is well put. I just might not have grasped all the elements of it here. The Marx is is, well, part of what Marx's critique about the state is that the state is not and cannot be the universal institution that Hegel takes it to be. That the universal class is in fact not a universal class. It is a class that has its own particular interests necessarily, and that given the way in which capitalism works in the industrial world now, it will always be in the possession of the capitalists, and the state will therefore be an instrument of class oppression. It functions as an instrument of class oppression precisely by trying to mitigate, right, the harsher forms of class oppression so that it will prevent the proletariat from actually revolting here. Right? So it looks as if, part of what Hegel is trying to say about civil society being able to ameliorate these things is something gets transferred into the state for it to do. And the state, in fact, does do something like that, but it does it because it wants to continue the existing relations of ownership and oppression and exploitation and so on. Nonetheless, right, what Marx thinks we need, Marx talks about how he thinks, in many ways Hegel inverts things, right? So part of it is that, you have a number of people with their own particular interests, and their own particular interests also being expressed in certain terms of class interests here, right? They have a certain type of we that is now entering into it. This is always going to be a very particularized kind of institutional setup. But I think what Marx wants to claim in the long run is that what we need to do is actually do something. We need to decentralize a lot of this kind of stuff and so on. When you look at the way he talks about the Paris Commune, when he says, gentlemen, Marx says, gentlemen, this is communism, right? This is what communism means. It means to have these kinds of democratic, institutions and so on that function on all kinds of levels about this, and where levels of authority are assigned by people, and there's no ongoing, offices are going to be circulating and so on. What Marx is doing is very much describing the way Hegel describes the Greek democratic polis. One of the ways, this is slightly kind of one of the ways in which Marx thinks about communism is basically Athens without the slaves and without the oppression of women. But Athens per se, without slaves and the oppression of women, couldn't have been Athens. However, given the technological advances and so on, since that we actually have the possibility now of creating, right, communism is small, small units now around the world, right, that will not in fact compete with each other, right, for resources and so on, but will be more in tune with sharing, and still the kind of constant Attic warfare that went on in ancient Athens, between Athens and Sparta and everybody else in Greece and the Mediterranean world and so on. So that we are, Hegel thought that there could be a sufficient conception of a we that could be established at the nation state level. And that was a mistake. It was the logic was right. We need the idea of there being a kind of coherent voice, a we that is an I and an I that is a we, where the status of the individual is neither denigrated, but neither is the polis or the communal thing itself just reduced to a set of aggregate of various individual viewpoints, but rather there being now a kind of common, right, common ethos, right? The institutions that would be created in that situation would be very much like what he thought he saw in the Paris Commune here. So there was actually a good historical example of what the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat would look like, what actual communism would look like. And why didn't it work? Well, it didn't get a chance to work. It was brutally suppressed by, right, both the German and the French armies. The German and the French armies had just been fighting each other, and the Germans let the French prisoners of war go so they could go attack, right, the communards and so on here. And thus the Paris Commune kind of passed into, revolutionary martyrdom and, revolutionary history and so on and so on. But I think Marx is by and large right that Hegel simply assumed that in this kind of modern industrial society, there could be this kind of established universal viewpoint, that is first person plural, a we, right, and so on. And then Hegel thought that the way to do that was simply to have the whole, was not to have a democracy, but to have the whole thing run by, in effect, technocrats, right? People who have been to the university and have the right kind of cultural formation, right? Bildung and all this stuff and so on here. That Hegel thought we couldn't rely on, this, now what, again, jumping around, right? What Habermas would call community freedom, right? A free-flowing, almost quasi-anarchic process here of, exchange of opinions and so on, and, doing things on the fly and responding to people's needs and so on. That could only be done on a much smaller scale, but without the kinds of competitive things that are built into the structure of competitive capitalism, right? Basically competition and the extraction of surplus value, right, through exploitation. Here, with smaller scale units now allied with each other and so on, we'd be able to get away from all that. Philosophically, the issue is between the first person and the first person plural, first person singular and first person plural. What the relation between the I and the we is, and how that relation between I and we requires a certain type of now institutional structure to be made real. Marx thought the Paris Commune gave us an idea about what that real on the ground institutional structure would in fact look like. And that if we had lots of Paris communes, we'd be in good shape. Now, that's an issue that needs to be debated some more and so on, but at least philosophically, you can see where Marx is both, he's criticizing Hegel, he's not rejecting all the elements of the Hegelian dialectic if what I've said is correct, that's up for grabs, but rather now taking Hegel one step further here. And we need to take Hegel and Marx perhaps one step further ourselves. Part of this is, and coming back to Omar's earlier question, this is one of the things that Frankfurt critical theory has tried to do, is not to be dogmatic Hegelians or dogmatic Marxists or anything like that, right? And so I'm claiming that Marx and Hegel solved everything around 1848 or something, but that we need to keep building on this. Maybe that was an answer to the question, or maybe it was an answer to a question you didn't ask.
Can you hear me? Talk a little bit more into it. Yeah, is this good? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have two related questions, both about philosophy. You mentioned as a point of continuity between Hegel and Marx, sort of Aristotelianism, albeit rendered self-conscious. And that reminded me of a quote that Hegel has in his introduction to philosophy of history, when he says that freedom as the ideal of that which is original and natural does not itself exist as original and natural. And that brings up another term for me, which is Rousseau, and his interest in avoiding anachronistic projections of the sort of reason we have in civil society onto the state of nature. So that while reason does exist in a relationship to the state of nature, it's not intrinsic to that. And I wanted to bring up those points as a way of asking, is there a sense in which Hegel, along with Kant, Rousseau, and maybe later Marx, these people are making a break from philosophy as done by Aristotle or as done traditionally, like a distinction between traditional versus critical philosophy? And the second question is that you mentioned Marx's critique of idealism, but in Theses on Feuerbach, that's one half. He also has a critique of materialism. But the impression I get from reading Theses on Feuerbach is that the Hegelian system is sort of the object here, where it's been split into contrary or opposing determinations. You have on the one hand Feuerbach, and on the other hand the more theologians, the Hegelians like Bauer. And I was just asking, what does this express for Marx? And can it even be expressed in a philosophical register? Is Marx's critique of Hegel end with philosophy, or does it require something else?
Oh, boy. Okay, so two questions, right? The traditional versus critical philosophy. Hegel thinks that one of the things he's doing is he's taking up the idea of Kant's notion of a critical philosophy. That is, one of the things that Kant has done is Kant has now redescribed the way philosophy has gone on in the past. To use a distinction that Adrian Moore has made, right? That philosophy has always tried to make sense of things. But with Kant says what we need to do is also make sense of making sense. We have to make, they have to shift this over to a critical way of not just making sense of things, say doing metaphysics or ontology, or just repeating natural science, making sense of making sense. And logic traditionally has been the way in which we make sense of making sense, that whatever violates the laws of logic is senseless. This gives us a new kind of way of thinking things critically. We want to ask, right, what are the limits or what are the limitations of making sense? If it's a limitation of making sense, then it's something we can always go beyond. As limitations are things that we just, we're kind of stuck at the border. We can see on the other side what it might be like. Limits, on the other hand, are the kinds of things you can't go beyond. The limits of sense are when you reach the limits of sense when now you're just babbling, you're talking nonsense. And Hegel thinks that we have to now take that one step further, and we have to actually now ask ourselves historically, in the middle of things, how are we making sense, right, of making sense historically? Here, this is part of what it means to be doing a philosophy based on a science of logic, as opposed to, say, just a philosophical psychology or anything like that. So that there is a big difference now between philosophy, traditional philosophy, and critical philosophy. The critical philosophy is if you take this Kantian way of looking at it, critical philosophy is self-conscious of what philosophy has always been doing, but without philosophy having formulated it in that way before. Having formulated it that way, we can go back down and look at various forms of doing philosophy and say they were still trying to do the same kind of thing. But Aristotelianism, of course, was not a historicist mode of philosophy. Aristotle had his conception of history. I mean, he certainly knew that there were a lot of things that had gone on in Greece before his lifetime, and that there was a kind of way in which things built up. And you read Aristotle's lectures, and he's taking all those other pre-Socratics and everybody else, and up to Plato and Socrates, taking them all into account, and this and that and so on, and talking about life in different parts of the Mediterranean and what he's heard about goes on in Persia and so on. But he's not historical, so he's not critical in that regard. He's not sufficiently self-conscious about where he stands. So critical philosophy is going to be one that, again, looks at a certain type of tension, that looks as if it's a straightforward contradiction. There's philosophy trying to achieve these kinds of timeless truths, making sense of making sense, being the logical structure of the way the world is, versus philosophy is simply one more element in an ongoing historical process that is mirroring its own time in various ways and can claim no type of authority over anything else. Those look like those are two different and opposed ways, a kind of historicist way of doing things and a very traditional logical way of doing things and so on. And Hegel's trying to bring those two together. I think that's, again, the right way to be looking at things, but that's another. Now, the other question, if I'm trying to now remember, maybe you need to repeat your second part of your question.
Yeah, it had to do with the fact that in Theses on Feuerbach, Marx is.
Okay. I think one of the things to look at that, by the way, is the very first thesis on Feuerbach, where he says the failure of all contemporary of existing materialism, right? It doesn't really take the self-consciousness stuff into consideration. It doesn't really take the thinking part. But the failure of all past idealism was it didn't understand the full material basis of all of this. Then there's a little, slight anti-Semitic slur that Marx throws in there about the Judaic nature of all this and so on. But right at in that first thesis on Feuerbach, right, without bleeping over the stuff about Judaism in the second part of the first thesis, there is, I think, pretty much what I've been arguing for, right now, which is that we have to have an idea of our place in the natural world as the self-conscious beings that we are, and the difference that self-consciousness makes to us. Hegel says in the lectures on the history of philosophy, he says, when you introduce self-consciousness into things, right, the content doesn't change, but everything else does. He says, this is the hinge point on which all of history turns, is that we now become these, self-interpreting animals, as Charles Taylor called us, and so on, that we become these shapeshifters who are, being our own products as we move throughout time, through history, in this way in which we build on the past and all the breakdowns that have occurred and so on. So I don't see that in the thesis on Feuerbach, especially if you look at the first one, that there's that much of a kind of antithesis. There's the last thesis about philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. In one respect, I mean, Hegel would say, well, yeah, of course, but you don't change the world until you've interpreted it. So that, yes, you want to change the world. Of course you do. Philosophy doesn't necessarily do that, but the people who want to change it won't be able to do it unless they're also informed by the kind of philosophical interventions into their own time and so on that we're doing for critical philosophy.
I think that was also at the tail end of the original question is, does Marxism take us to a new philosophy or does it take us beyond philosophy? Was that also?
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, so one of the, like in many things, it all depends on what you mean by X, right? It all depends on what you mean by philosophy here. And one of the features of philosophy is that a lot of philosophy consists of wondering whether or not such and such and such really is or is not philosophy. One way of some philosophers think there really is an essence to philosophy. They say things like, Hegel isn't a philosopher. I mean, he's something else. Maybe he's a religious thinker, or maybe he's a sociologist, kind of a priori sociologist, but he's not doing philosophy. Philosophy is what Bertrand Russell did, or something like that. This is a non-essentialist kind of view. This is a view that philosophy itself, like everything else, is in a process of becoming. And that philosophy is a place where you really are always forever being driven back to ground zero, is therefore always going to be reinterpreting itself as to what it is it's supposed to be doing. So you might think that the distinction between traditional and critical philosophy is the distinction between philosophy and something that isn't philosophy. Here, many people have, actually, like when you look on various internet pages, say about Jürgen Habermas, he's sometimes introduced as a great 20th century sociologist, and sometimes he's introduced as a great philosopher. Well, I mean, Jürgen himself thinks of himself as a critical philosopher who's also tied into various kinds of empirical sociological products that are not extrinsic or just accidental features of his own thought and so on. So are we going into a new philosophy, going beyond philosophy or into a new type of philosophy and so on? It's an interesting debate, but it's probably one that takes us away from what we should be talking about, which is really what we should be thinking about, as opposed to, if we're going to hire Karl Marx into our university, does he get a position in the philosophy department, or should we put him in the economics department, or maybe he should go into the government department, or maybe we should transfer him over into the interdisciplinary studies department and so on. Yeah, I mean, one way, just who cares? Just hire him, hire him and have him start teaching courses here. So I don't know that asking whether or not this is a new philosophy or beyond philosophy or and so on is really the best way to go about it. I would look at it in kind of Hegelian way, say this is another way in which philosophy is now taking shape as its own time grasping thoughts.
Mr. Pinkard, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for doing this interview. I really enjoyed it. One other philosophical question, might be a little really basic, but I'm wondering what reasons we have to think that what Heidegger is talking about when he talks about historicizing, what Hegel is talking about when he talks about history is the same thing, or if there's even just like a possibility that they're not the same thing, and so that the finitude on the one hand and Hegel's understanding of the development of history might be in less contradictions than would occur otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, you're right. They might not be talking about the same kind of thing and so on. So, and that's again up for grabs, and we ought to be, put some Heidegger text down in front of us, put some Hegel text down in front of us, and start going through them. But I think that Heidegger himself, especially if you read the first lectures on German idealism, they're going to be they're being translated, so they'll be out fairly soon. I'm told here, the 1928 lectures on German idealism. By the time he gets to Hegel, he's pretty clear that he's engaged with Hegel, and that he thinks that, first of all, he thinks that most of the traditional kind of spiritual readings of Hegel are wrong, and that he sees Hegel really in a way that he hadn't seen him in Being and Time as being much more of a challenge to himself, to his own way of thinking, than he had given it credit for in Being in Time. It may be he was responding to something else, because, you know, in Being in Time, Heidegger introduces this chapter on Hegel and temporality by quoting from Reason and History. And it says, der Geist fällt in die Zeit, right? Spirit falls into time. And he says, this shows that Hegel really is a kind of ontotheologian. That is, he thinks that there's something called spirit, and it exists, you know, eternally, and it falls into temporality here, which is the wrong way to think about it. The problem with that, and maybe by 1928 or 29, he'd come to realize this. The problem was that Heidegger was using the old Lausanne transcription of Reason and History, and from none of Hegel's manuscripts or lecture notes or anything else that we have from students, is there any indication that Hegel actually ever said spirit falls into time? That sentence simply doesn't occur in Hegel. Nor, given the Hegelian system as I understood it, could it occur in Hegel unless Hegel were mistaken about his own views. So Heidegger is, you know, looking at this saying, look, there's something, you know, kind of profoundly, profoundly disturbing about this, because the whole position in Being in Time has been now based on this kind of rejection of a certain type of Hegelian position. And now that I'm realizing this Hegelian position has a lot more going on for it than I had given it credit for originally. What do I now have to say about this? And it has to do with, you know, he is very clear that it's the Hegelian conception of the infinite here that is at stake, that kind of infinite just can't be maintained by the kind of entity he calls Dasein, the being there, the existence entity there. Now, is this the same kind of thing? First of all, Heidegger wants to reject Hegel's philosophy of history. I mean, the Germans have a term, they talk about, you know, Geschichtsphilosophie, right? Philosophy of history philosophy, with Hegel's the paradigm example, versus this kind of historicity that Heidegger thinks is what we're about. And that Hegel fundamentally rejects the concept of historicity here in favor of this philosophy of history view. But if it's really, you know, so if you're a Heideggerian, you want to say, we are fundamentally caught up in historicity, fundamentally caught up in finitude. The great mistake of the West is to think that there's some way out of it. Hegel is maybe the sublime expression of this and so on, but he's still part of it, because he thinks that we need to have this conception of thought as infinite. And that itself is merely, as he comes to think of later on, right, in the 40s and 50s and so on, that's merely just one particular way of taking up the relation between thought and being. It's just a contingent process. It could have happened any other kind of way. And therefore, Hegel's position on this is somewhat dogmatic. And as I said earlier, the Hegelian reply to this is, actually, it's not dogmatic. I mean, I tried to show how this develops, you know, out of a certain ground zero starting point with being and nothing. And so, but that's, in many ways, I think, you know, there's a kind of good historical question to be asked here, which is that, at least in the way that philosophy has developed in the 20th and early 21st century, Heidegger won, as it were, in terms of just the way things have gone. That is, everybody's a finitist in philosophy. We're all fallibilists now, and so on, right? We've given up on Cartesian certainty. We've given up on all this idea, a lot of ideas of necessity. And all we really can do is just kind of, you know, say, reformulate our intuitions and put them into a kind of reflective equilibrium, that we're caught in the middle of it. We can't get outside of it, so on. And that, you know, something like the Hegelian view just now seems, to many people, I think, preposterous. Whatever other greatness there might be in Hegel, it just seems preposterous to think that there's an absolute way of thinking about these things here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. You mentioned early on that Hegel wasn't a Democrat.
Yes.
It seems to me that there are a lot of ways in which Hegel is inheriting Enlightenment liberalism. And one that it always strikes me very strange that you also talk about how when you were young, you were opposed, or you didn't sit right with you, a kind of statist vision of Hegel. That he was affirmative of the Prussian bureaucratic state. Now, obviously, in some sense, he is. But, and one other thing I would sort of want to fold in is, even though we've talked a lot about Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, it does seem to me that Marx is, even as a young man before the revolution of 1848, and certainly after, he tends not to address Hegel critically so much as to address the young Hegelians. In fact, there are a lot of gestures early on where he's saying they're falling below the threshold of Hegel. And of course, famously, in the afterward Capital, he says that he is a student of the great master Hegel. He's going to defend him against his critics. And it seems to me that part of that is Marx's insistence that we view Hegel in his time as a bourgeois thinker. And I want to address that in relation to Hegel's understanding of the state. Because it seems to me that if we take Hegel as a kind of statist, then we really take him out of a larger liberal tradition, which is, in other words, we could view the educated, top students from the universities as manning the state as a great revolution of meritocracy. And the subordination of the, an expression of the subordination of the state to society, but rather than the way that we would think about that in terms of technocracy. And so I guess I'm wondering, is the state, first of all, is Hegel arguing for the subordination of the state to society? And in some sense, the government of public reason. And similarly, I guess I'm asking this: is what Marx means by the state really something that it emerges after Hegel's time? It's not just the proletariat, but it's really the state that Marx has in mind really isn't the same thing as what liberals had in mind. That, in other words, we view Hegel as a liberal, or we say that Hegel was affirmative of the Prussian state. Are those really slurs, or are those part of a much wider sort of liberal project of subordination of the state to society that Marx thinks really has entered into crisis under the conditions of capital and transformed the state?
I think this is a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, so the big question, right, is the state being subordinated to society? It's a way of saying, is the state really, always an instrument in the hands of the ruling class? I take it that's what it would mean. Let me just come back very quickly. I mean, Hegel is Jean-François Kervegan, his book on Hegel's philosophy of right here, on the actual and the rational here, has, I think, convincingly argued really that Hegel is a very in some respects, a kind of standard 19th century, slightly authoritarian, but only slightly authoritarian liberal. Remember, liberalism doesn't come to terms with democracy really until the mid-20th century. Liberals on the whole have never been Democrats. They are forced into coming to terms with democracy by virtue of the workers' movement and by virtue of what they see as all the great threats and so on that the workers' movement is posing for these kinds of things. Early American progressives, the so-called, the progressive movement of the 1920s was very much a kind of, technocracy of merit. The very best would, kind of do things and so on, and there would be all these various mechanisms to be set up, right, so that whatever votes people had didn't really matter to how well the state ran. And these people would run the state, in fact, in the interest of these people, in a way that these people could not themselves adequately on their own comprehend. So Hegel belongs in that respect to that kind of tradition here. He's very suspicious of democracy. But on the other hand, then you read in the philosophy of right, and you read especially in the lectures and so on, right? Hegel has a a very clear idea that nonetheless, right, the state has to be responsive to the actual needs and desires and aspirations of, you know, the people in society, but without being a democracy here. When in the lectures, which are included in the editions, right, that Gans put in, right, into the philosophy of right, there's a section in the States, I forget the exact paragraph, where he basically is referring to the way in which Hardenberg has, in the Hardenberg-Stein reform period, right, Hardenberg has taken over everything and is really doing it from a top-down perspective, he says, right? What we really need is more things coming up from the bottom, right, as in fact it was used to be done, i.e. when, you know, Stein was really, right, more running the show here. So Hegel is not a statist in the sense that he just thinks, look, you know, in the way in which, say, perfectly reactionary statists, you know, bourgeois statists might be saying, we know best, we'll do best for you, now shut up and go back to work. He thinks that there need to be all these kinds of inputs from people. These are going to be coming from the estates, right? These are coming from the corporations, all these other, you know, the corporazione, not the large behemoths we know here. These are all ways in which there will be input into the decision-making powers of the state, but there will be just input. They won't have any actual, you know, let's say, force behind them, right, to actually, you know, make these things stick. It's still up to the you know, the technocrats. Was Hegel, you know, glorifying the Prussian state? No. I mean, if you look at the Prussian state, the way it was arranged, and then you look at the way the philosophy of right is arranged, they don't correspond here. Hegel is talking about a modern European state here, which is going to take over what he thinks of as the best that is now coming out of the post-Napoleonic settlement here. His friend, von Hagen, right, wrote shortly after Hegel's death, he said a lot of people in Prussia thought that Hegel was really a great friend of the Prussian state, but they didn't realize just how English Hegel really was. I mean, he wanted a very limited monarchy. He wanted a society with a lot more kind of rights and so on for ordinary people. What he didn't think was that still, right, is that any kind of, you know, universal suffrage and so on was in any way a workable option in the contemporary world as he knew it here. And that therefore we did need this kind of, you know, rule by the meritocratic, yes, right. I've called them technocrats. They are technocrats, but also it's important to note that Hegel also thought that they had to be these people of cultural formation, you know, what the Germans call a gebildete person, right? Person, you know, who, I mean, as I've somewhat sarcastically put it, sometimes it's as it were, it's being run by technocrats who also have subscriptions to the symphony orchestra and the opera here, right? They have to be appropriately, you know, cultured and therefore develop the right sense of judgment and taste and so on in making all these kinds of things here. So Hegel is not a defender of the Prussian state per se. He does like the idea of a German bureaucracy. He thinks the German bureaucracy is, right, much more efficient and also, you know, capable of taking, you know, going beyond its own interests and so on. So he has a kind of faith in a, as it were, a kind of English monarch with a German bureaucracy, right, underpinning it, and a kind of French civil service that is going to, you know, be, you know, enlivened by all this and such and such. What it doesn't, but that doesn't correspond to the contemporary Prussian state as it was. Hegel was perhaps being overly optimistic in the sense that he thought that the Prussian state would then perhaps take this kind of form, but nonetheless, right, that was it. He did say, you know, I mean, one of the ways in which he really got his predictions about the future wrong in one respect was when he, in his lectures, when he said, given the rationality of things, given the way things have worked out now, it is now, he said, impossible for European states to go to war with each other. It would just be so irrational that nobody would be able to do it. Furthermore, people wouldn't stand for it, right, and so on. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong about predicting that whether European states would go to war with each other. He was right about the sheer irrationality of it all, but that wasn't clearly enough, right, to you know, stop, you know, what was going to happen there. Does that respond to what you were talking about, or?
Yeah.
Let me get the microphone.
discussed how Hegel saw the dialectic of historical progress playing out through the breakdown of previous modes of existence or modes of life. And you contrasted a process that would be extremely drawn out, like the breakdown of the ancient world of modernity, with something that is very discrete or immediate, such as a revolution. And it's very clear that Hegel was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution, by Napoleon in particular, in a tremendous and immediate way, breaking the rest of Europe from feudalism and from the system of estates as it had previously existed as the son of the revolution. Does Hegel have a concept of what conditions, whether the breaking down or the change in history happens in a drawn-out manner or a discrete manner? Is this something that's conditioned by a particular historical period or a particular set of circumstances?
I don't know if there is really a Hegelian answer to that, because the answer is going to be, well, it all depends on what the particular kind of conditions are going to be and so on. He did seem to think that, the French Revolution was the great moment. Prior to the French Revolution, he also thought the Dutch overthrow of the Spanish monarchy and the Spanish, possession of the Netherlands and so on was a great moment, and it also didn't have the kind of French Revolutionary, aftermath and so on. The French Revolution, though, was much more self-conscious. It proclaimed the rights of man. It was, and it happened rapidly, right? Showing that, basically the tipping point had already been reached. Here, it then extended itself off into the Napoleonic period. So we have 1789, but it's not until 1815 that the revolutionary, gains are all consolidated. So, in fact, given the comparison with the way the ancient world gradually just fell apart and faded away over a series of centuries, just rotting out from underneath itself, the French Revolution was still a pretty compact affair, even though it included, for many people, was an entire lifetime between 89 and 15 here, 1789 and 1815. So what accounts for this? Well, part of it accounts for just how, rotten the foundations were, but a large part of it was the way in which the French Revolution now for the first time was a very self-conscious revolution. Because the ancient world simply fell apart without anybody going around saying, down with the ancient world, let's, storm the Pantheon and so on, and bring it all down. No, it just collapsed and was replaced with something else here. And I might just add, in the philosophy of history, Hegel has a real problem with it. Why did it happen that the ancient world collapsed and still then rebuilt itself later on into the medieval world here? Why didn't it just collapse and nothing happened after that? Or Europe just, kind of go back into barbarism or something like that? And he had his own particular kind of theory about this, which I don't think worked, but nonetheless, right? The idea of the conscious theoretical collapse is very important there. This is something Marx, and then of course later on, right, Lenin is going to take up, that one of the big differences about the so-called Marxist revolution is going to be, it's going to be a self-conscious revolution. We know we're making a revolution. We know what we are trying to do. We're not going to just extend it out over, let it just happen and so on, but we're actually making the revolution. This has been a focus of criticism, of course, of Marx, but also of Lenin, that they were too conscious of this. If the historical dialectic really does work, well, why bother to have a party leading a revolution? Why not just let capitalism collapse on its own? And it may take a couple of centuries to do that, but well, maybe that's what will happen. Hegel was much more of the kind of, we have to do things self-consciously and so on and so on.
All right, so I think we're getting close to our 2-hour closure time. I wanted to ask one final question. I'm really struck by the remark.
I'm really struck by the remark you made that Hegel is much more English than is typically assumed.
Yeah,
and
that's a remark that comes from one of his very best friends, von Hagen.
Indeed. One of the ways in Platypus we talk about is the radical English tradition that gets picked up by Americans in our revolutionary period. Tomorrow, during this Platypus conference, we're going to be taking a tour here in DC of some of the monuments, like the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, and we're going to be asking questions about how American radicalism, British radicalism, was important to Marxism later on. Now, Hegel himself says that America is the land of the future, where in ages that lie before us, the burden of world's history shall reveal itself. And I wondered, could you speak to what still tasks us about Hegel regarding that revolutionary tradition? Where do we now stand regarding what Hegel would have wanted of us today?
This is a often quoted part from Hegel. Hegel did say that, right? My own view about that is a little more, you might say, a little more cynical, you might say, about what Hegel was saying. One of the things that occurred right after the Philosophy of Right was published is that any number of people, including like Heinrich Paulus and then the philosopher Krug, whom he had earlier talked about deducing the pen and so on, they all pointed to the American Revolution. They say there's no discussion of the Philosophy of Right, the American Revolution. Edward Gans, right, again, Hegel's closest friend, and the person who's really kind of also lecturing on the Philosophy of Right at the same time in Berlin with Hegel's approval, claimed that the North Americans had shown that, in fact, you don't need a monarch, that a republic would be just as adequate, if not better, expression of the Hegelian view about freedom and so on than any kind of English monarchical system. Now, Hegel, basically what Hegel said over and over again was, in his lectures, was that you can't draw any real conclusions from the Americans. I mean, first of all, it's way far away. It's a small place. It's kind of, he thought, oh, it's a backwater compared to Europe, right? And that so the cynical part is, I don't want to talk about it here. And the way I'll get around with that is I'll say, it's the land of the future, right? I mean, maybe, the burden of world history perhaps will fall on its shoulders. Well, maybe not, so basically, I don't want to have to deal with that. I want to deal with the situations on the continent and also including Britain, which is where I think all the action is, and so on and so on and so on here. That's a little bit of a kind of parochialism on Hegel's part, but I think that's probably what's going on there. Now, it's again slightly romantic to think otherwise, but of course he says, well, maybe there'll be a great, kind of, Trojan Greek, war between North America and South America that will transform things and so on. Hegel did say, we had the report from Christian Weise, one of his students. It's a letter to Hegel in the late 1820s. And he says, you and I were having a conversation yesterday in which you said, of course, in the future, there are going to be all these shapes of spirit that are going to be completely different from what we have now. It's going to take on new forms. And of course, it doesn't stop here at this particular time. It can't stop here at this particular time. And then Weise says, I thought more about this, and I don't see why you don't say it stops at this particular time, and I want to discuss this more with you here. We don't have a reply from Hegel on that because the odds are the reply was oral. That is, a few days later, he ran to Christian Weise again. He said, here's what I said. And maybe Weise later on was a kind of expositor of Hegel, especially the aesthetics and so on. Weise probably was, I don't know, relatively convinced by whatever it was Hegel had to say. So yeah, this is all consistent. America is the land of the future. Something big will happen there. Who knows what it will be here, right? It's a big place. And once they fill the whole continent up, once there's no more border, once there's no more, place to go, you reach the Pacific Ocean. He said, at that point, it will fall back on itself and it will have to reinstitute something like a monarchy, right? Because that's just the way these kinds of things go. And how that will actually work out and maybe a coming conflict with South America we won't be around for it, but something different will probably emerge. And that, as far as he was concerned, was all that's all he really wanted to say about that at the time.
Well, Mr. Pinkard, Omair, Platypus wants to thank you both for your generosity with your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for all the questions. I mean, these are, I've got to now, immediately go down and write some notes down about all the kinds of questions you asked and the answers I gave. Right, so I can remember what I need to be thinking about now. Well, there is a new Sartre book that'll be appearing in January on Sartre's appropriation of Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger. So, thank you.
Thank you all very much. This recording will be available later, and tomorrow we can continue with our events. Tonight, for those who are local, we're going to have one more event tonight, a book launch with Dr. Spencer Leonard on Marx and Engels on imperialism, selected journalism from 1851 to 1862. And that'll be our concluding event right after this interview with Professor Pinkard. Thank you all.